So we're on Daf Dalet, and we have so far, besides for the introductions about Rosh Hashanah, we introduced the Medrash about Brias HaOlamis, how at the outset of creation Hashem wished to create the world Midas Hadin. However, once he saw the world was unable to survive with this Midas Hadin, he mixed in with it Midas HaRachamim. And we asked the question about why on earth would Hashem want to create the world with Midas Hadin when we know that Hashem's nature is good and the nature of those who are good is to do good. It seems surprising that he would wish to create the world in a manner of din, of severity, of judgment, of stringency. And we then brought a medrash that brought a moshel on this of a king with cups, fragile cups. There was a question that the cups were unable to hold the hot water nor the cold water, so he mixed them together and hoped that the cups would survive. Similarly, this reflects the nature of creation, that if Hashem would have created purely with rachamim, then people would have taken liberties and there would have been a lot of sinfulness. Whereas if it was with judgment, no one would have been able to live up to the exacting standards of Hashem. So instead, din and rachamim mixed together to make it plausible. The issues of din and rachamim, which is the primary, the main issues in the hemshekh, won't be dealt with until the third minor and onwards, until the end of the hemshekh. For the meantime, we're going to focus on the concept of cups that's brought as the moshel in this medrash. And so far we've said that a cup is primarily a receptacle. It's first and foremost a receptacle, something that receives things within it. And as such, it is a moshel for Malchus, which receives all of its content from the spheres above it. Because Malchus, we say about Malchus, Leis Lo Megamer Klum. Malchus itself has nothing of its own, and it's constructed out of out of contents which are collated and collected from the spheres above it. We also pointed out that in Malchus Atzilus is also the Sheirish, is the source of all the Neshamis. The Madrega we call Knesses Yisrael. Knesses Miloshin Knesses, something that contains everything in it. So similarly has associations with a kais. And so our understanding of the Medrash at this point is that it's referring to the creation of the world, but more specifically, it's honing in on the idea of Malchus, and in Malchus itself, specifically the idea of Knesset Yisrael, the Neshamas of Yisrael. So we then pointed out that in the relationship between Hashem and the Jewish people, the Neshamas Yisrael, the Neshamas Yisrael are called an Isha. So we've said this is the focus, that when we talk Kais, if we're going to hone into it very in the most granular way, we're going to be referring to Neshamas Yisrael. Neshamas Yisrael are referred to as an Isha, as a Kala. Chassan and Kala. B'yim Chassan Nasei, so Matan Torah. Hashem is called the Chassan, and the Neshamas Yisrael are called the Kala. What is the relationship between the Chassan and Kala? So we contrasted it with the relationship between a Rav and a Talmud and a Chassan and Kala. Rav and Talmud, the Hashbah is a Hashbah Chitzenis, is a much more superficial encounter. When a person wants to convey a concept, they can only convey an impression of that concept, a reflection of that concept, and not the concept itself. The person doesn't have the rudimentary skills of understanding, then the teacher will not be able to teach them. There has to be an existing. He's not going to create something new. He's not going to create a new mind. He's just going to furnish a mind that already exists. And that's what we call the hashbah chitzonis. Whereas in the intercourse between a man and a woman, that's what we call hashbah pnimis. Because the man doesn't just convey a reflection of himself in the ejaculation of the semen, he's rather conveying his very essence, that contained within that semen, he's got the reproductive power of producing an entirely new human being. So that was how we described it. But we made an important clarification. It's all well and good for a man to think, it's to seem that he has this reproductive quality and he's able to produce semen, which can produce an identical model of himself, full with intellect and emotions and feelings. However, the man alone cannot produce that child. He first of all has to have intercourse with a woman, and it's the woman, actually, we described in the last paragraph, who really does produce the child. She is the producer. And although we only talked about it briefly over here, we're gonna say a few words about it again at the end of this mimer. It's going to elaborate on it much more in the second mimer. But the moshel of Isha and the idea of Ashpa Pnimis and the role of the makabel, the role of the kois, the role of the cup, the receptacle in that relationship, is going to be elaborated upon later. But for the meantime, what the Rebbe Rashab's done over here is he's expanded our appreciation of the term kois. Kois, until in the first paragraph when it was introduced, was an idea of a receptacle, something that receives. It's just a container. In the example, in the extension of the moshel into an isha, we understand that it's also a catalyst. It's also transformative. It's also creative. The kois doesn't just contain what was already there. It does something new with it. Something that wasn't there. A child. There's no child in semen. What the man produces is only the potential for something. But there's no child there. The woman invents a child. She creates a child. She reproduces. It's a production of a child. It's a creation. It's a hevia chadosha. It's a new thing. And so the moshel of a kois now, if we're going to say all of these things are koises, then when we think about a kois, we have to think about it much more broadly and not just purely as a receptacle and a container. It's something that when something goes into this kois, the kois has the power to transform and invent and create. Okay? But for now, we're going to move on to a different moshel. We're going to extend the concept of kois and the notion of a kois to dibur, to speech. And that's going to be the main focus of the rest of this mimer. Speech. How does speech function as a kois, as a makabel? And what does speech do in relation to the things it's receiving from? Be it consciousness, intellectual ideas, emotional feelings. What does speaking about, what does the speaking out of those things achieve, and how does it interplay with the things it's receiving from? Okay? Daf Dalet. Uvadugma kazois anu meitzim gamkin bedibur. And in a similar fashion, we also find, with regards to speech, sheyesh ba yisrin koyach al haseichel umides choli, which has a superior ability over the intellect and emotions which furnish it. Okay, so it says the punchline straight away at the beginning. But even though all of the expressions that are expressed in speech, whatever someone speaks about, where do they originate from? They originate from the person's consciousness, be it about intellectual matters or emotional matters. Speech, the letters and words of speech, doesn't have anything on its own until it's constructed into sentences and expressions which are communicable, though speech is devoid of any meaning. It's purely through expressing some aspect of a person's consciousness that speech takes on form and is able to function as speech, as coherent speech. All speech is that which it receives from the keiches that are prior to it. For example, when a person speaks intelligent speech, at the moment when you're saying something intelligent and coherent and intellectual, then at that moment the person's intellectual consciousness is being manifest through the person's speech. Similarly to when a person is articulating their feelings of love or their feelings of anger towards something, it's at that moment they're receiving from their emotional consciousness, be it, if it's matters of love, it will be from their quality of chesed. If it will be anger, it will be from gvura. And how's this relationship, how is this process achieved? So first of all, when a person has consciousness of be it something to do with their something intellectual, something emotional. So it's either intellectual or emotional we're focusing on here. What happens first is that will become expressed in what we call the oisius hamachshava, the letters of thought. So we have the way we have self-consciousness. There's consciousness that's happening before it's self-conscious, right? A person is capable of processing, having intellectual processes, which a person is not self-aware of. Yeah? But as soon as it becomes self-aware, that's in there to be a gilui, a manifestation, a revelation of it. That is in machshava. That's what we usually call consciousness. Consciousness is something that we are conscious of, we are aware of. So a person may have an idea or a feeling, and their first awareness of that will be as it expresses itself in words of the mind. So you think about it, yeah. That's stage one. After you've thought about it, it will then be able to be expressed in the words, in the letters of speech. Yeah, in order for you to say something, you have to have already, you have to be thinking about it. You can't say something without there being a constant thought pattern going on at the same time. And therefore, so what would you expect then? The initial expression of the idea or the feeling is going to be more powerful and stronger in machshava than it is in dibur. There's going to be much more of a gilui oy. The intensity of the feeling or the intensity of the idea is going to be more emphasized and more stressed in thought than it would be in speech, because shuhu hamakabel rishain min haseichel midas. It's the first port of call. It's the first recipient. So the idea that's there in a person's intellect or in their emotional state, that first outlet for that is going to be in the mind, in the machshava, in the way a person's thinking, and there it's going to be much more powerful before it can then go through a further tzimtzum, a further sort of constraint, and be contained within words. So you see, for example, in your mind, you are able to contain a whole lot more in a much shorter span of time. You can think about something in a much broader sense in your mind than what you're capable of doing through your speech. So speech is a far greater tzimtzum, for lack of a better word. Is a far greater funneling of what was an original either intellectual or emotional consciousness. Does that make sense? So the machshava is the makabel rishon. And so there's a far greater intensity of the idea or the feeling in a person's thinking than there is in a person speaking. And therefore, and that is why the machshava person's, because thought is in a sense a keli, it's capable of absorbing a far greater degree of the intensity of the nefesh, be it on intellectual issues or emotional issues. Therefore, it's able to be meyuchad im nefesh. So a person is, there's no moment when a person isn't thinking. It's thinking is a constant thing, just like the nefesh is constant. The thinking is constant because it has this close relationship with it. There's to a point where you can't. It's almost impossible to distinguish between what is seichel and midas and what is machshava, because they're all they exist, they coexist constantly. So that's one thing. That's one aspect of machshava which makes it very distinct from dibur. It's constant. Another thing about machshava which makes it distinct from dibur, and it's all to do with this relationship that it has with the nefesh. But einam yotzim chutz la'etzem. A person's thoughts are not revealed to other people. They don't go. They're not externalized to anything or to anyone other than itself. Thoughts are personal. Furthermore, a third distinction between the word between thinking and speaking, the ein ha'osiyos murgashim. The letters are not murgash. The words of thought, the word letters and words of thought are not murgash. They're not felt. What does that mean? They're not felt. They're not clumsy like the word letters and words of speech. You can squeeze in intense amounts of words and letters into a very short space and time in thinking. Whereas in speech it has to be orderly, and what you can't, saying zocher and shomer at the same time, you can't do that. You can think at the same time though. Right?
How?
What do you mean how? A person can't hold two machshavas.
Same time?
Yeah? No?
Yeah, but you have a couple of billion of them in your brain. No?
You're holding thoughts.
Your brain holds
Consciously.
machshava.
Not consciously.
You're saying, you mean on focusing, you're saying?
Yeah.
Even
Well,
consciously though, you can think of.
Take for example, let's talk about letters. When you're reading, you're at the same time reading letters and thinking words, and you've got multiple letters going on at the same time. You don't have to. You can read. The fact that you can read quicker than you can speak it indicates what? That there's a different. The function of oisius hamachshava is very different to oisius hadibur, because they don't have the same boundaries in a way that the letters of speech have, where one can't infringe upon the other, because if they do it would be incoherent speech. Whereas in thought, the letters and the words can merge very easily. Even when you read, if you just focus your peripheral vision, you can contain a huge amount, all happening at the same time. And the reason is because the letters of speech, letters of thought, are completely attached to the nefesh, and so they have this type of bittul, this lack of self distinction, and lack of limitation of one vis-a-vis the other. What does it mean to be bottle? What does it mean to have bittul? To have bittul is to not be a yesh, to not have this hargosha, not have this yesh murgash, not have this sensitivity to itself, such that words and letters can combine, and what it takes in a very short time to think would take a much longer time to speak out. So we've described three distinctions here between thought and speech. One is the constancy of thought, the internal nature of thought, and thirdly, the bittul of thought, the lack of yeshus in the letters of thought, and all of those are because of its close association with the nefesh, because it's the mekabel rishon from the nefesh, and so inevitably there's a greater gilu, there's a greater expression of the nefesh in machshava than it can be in dibur, because all of those things are the opposite in dibur. Masha enkein oisius hadibur. We see in the letters of speech, the opposite is the case. Sheyesh behem bechinas pirut. In the letters of speech, there's pirut, there's separation between times of speaking. Eis ledabe ve'eis lachshes chuli. There's a time to speak and there's a time to be silent. So unlike thought, which is constant, speech, you have pirut. You have moments when you speak and there's moments when you don't speak. Furthermore, ve'hein miskalim v'yotzim chutz la'atzem. They are externalized. They're not internal functions of the self. And thirdly, v'hein boim b'murgish. And they are tangible. Unlike the letters of speech, which we just said are have bittul. They haven't got this yeshus. The letters of speech do have yeshus. They have boundaries. They can't stumble over each other. And in the articulation of speeches, it's made up of physical matter, of speech, of the sound that is produced from your mouth. They are materialized. Okay, subtly, but it's still a material with sound waves, with breath, to a far greater degree than what we have in thought. Now, these three distinctions, the reason why dibur has these qualities and machshava does not have these qualities is because in dibur, the oir, what it receives from the nefesh, what it's receiving from the nefesh is mitzumtzum. As I said before, it's a much great, it's far reduced, the intensity of the expression of be it an intellectual idea or an emotional feeling. By the time it reaches speech, the intensity of the concept or the feeling has already been diminished and reduced. Masha enkim ba'itis machshava, which is not the case in the letters of thought. Whilst it's still in thought, the idea or the feeling are at a great degree of intensity. And that is the reason behind all of these differences we mentioned above between thought and speech, like it's talked about in other places. So now it's going to use the word v'nimtza. Always remember the word v'nimtza. V'nimtza is a word in a maimah that comes to sort of conclude after a discussion about something. So v'nimtza, so it's found to be the case, based on what we said above, and it's going to usually make a statement that you want to remember, because it's key to the flow of the ideas that are going to come forward. V'nimtza, d'chol kabbalas eir hadibur u'min ha'seichel u'mides u'meir ha'eir b'machshava yosef b'dibur. So sort of a summary of what we just said above and a conclusion of what we said above is 2 points. That everything that is articulated in speech is originate or comes from the person's consciousness, be it intellectual or be it emotional. And that intellectual and emotional consciousness is what is mashpia into the person's dibur, and which enables the dibur to have something to say. Dibur on its own has nothing to say. Yeah? It requires be it an idea or a feeling to come from the person's nefesh, from their seichel and midas, en route through the machshava, that reaches the person that they're able to talk about it. That's point number one. And point number two is umeira oiba machshava yesem b'dibur chuli, and this expression of the person's consciousness is far greater and more intense in a person's thought than it is in their speech. Okay? So that's our venimta. That's a key statement. And now it's going to go on. So not just the content of what a person says originates from their consciousness, again, be it emotional or intellectual. In addition, the form of articulation also comes from a person's intellect, comes from the nefesh. So it's not as if the person's consciousness provides the subject matter, the content, the rough content matter, which is, but then dibur is a faculty of the self, is an ability within the soul which knows how to express that. So dibur, what quality does dibur have? Dibur doesn't have any content, but it knows how to produce coherent sentences. It knows how to expertly articulate the idea. So you might think that's the quality of dibur. Dibur at least has that. It might not have anything to talk about, but when you give it something to talk about, it knows how to talk about it. No, not just the content, also the manner of expression. What we call here tzirufi eisius hadibur, the combination of the letters of dibur into words and sentences, and the syntax of sentences doesn't come from dibur. It's not a quality that dibur has of its own. It's also dictated from where? From the person's chachma, from the person's intellect. So it's going to explain that. So what we're doing is we're reducing dibur to be as empty and dependent, good, empty and dependent on the keiches shelamayla mimana, on those superior qualities of consciousness, the intellectual and the emotional consciousness. So let's explain this idea. How is it that when a person, the form and the method of articulation is not a product of speech, but is a product of the person's intellect, which dictates how a person speaks? So he says, now this is slightly problematic. This is a reference to a pasuk in Kehelis. Now, it's quoted like this in a lot of places in Chassidus. The problem is there isn't such a pasuk in Kehelis. It doesn't say matzrif lechachma. It says matzrif lekesef. So the pasuk in Kehelis talks about matzrif lekesef v'kur lezahav. Matzrif is a refining bowl, and a core is a crucible. So gold and silver, basically the refining of gold and silver is done through these tools. But then the pasuk continues that Hashem is able to examine people's hearts. So, when it comes to material matters, you have these tools, but Hashem has this sort of like superior quality, is able to figure out what's going on in a person's heart and to refine and separate things. So the whole idea of tziruf, of refining, is the separating of the pure metals from the waste. So that's what it says there. It says matzrif lekesef. But you see in the footnote here, it mentions how it says in the Drush Chas in the Mittel Rebbe, kach yesh matzrif lechachma. So he indicates that just like there is a matzrif for kesef, there's a matzrif lechachma. So what is the notion of a matzrif, a refining? It's able to sort of take in a refining, what do you have? You have metal that is maybe mixed up with lots of other things. What you want to do is you want to extract the pure metals and be able to bind them together. Yeah? So here it's in the context of tziruf eisius, of combining the combination of the letters of speech. So the matzrif, so a lot of this is resting on this idea that there's a matzrif l'chachma, even though we don't have a posuk that says a matzrif l'chachma. But conceptually, it seems that there is, what we're arguing for here is that there is such a component to chachma, which is the source of the combination of letters. The decision about how to express things because you can have the same idea and you can have two different people would express it in totally different ways, as we saw in the letters that we wrote in the last minor. The same minor, so why don't you both express it the same way? Because Tziruf Asius is different, and it's a product of your Chachma. And it depends, therefore, on the way that a person's, here we're focusing on intellect and not emotions, the way the concept that a person has is going to be manifest. So once a person has an idea, for example, as part of its process of expressing itself, first of all through Chachma, first of all through Machshava, ultimately in Dibur, it comes with a package. It comes with a package of sort of not just the concept itself, but the way the concept is going to be articulated. And that is also what is conveyed or sort of transmitted to Dibur. Yeah? We're going to have a slightly long bracket here. Im hayois shegilui haseichel hu bechinas hasaga de bina. So 1 second. We just said the matzrif is from where Chachma. When we're talking about a conceptual idea which is formed to the extent that it can be expressed, that's already in bina. Bina is the understanding of an idea, giving it a fulsome breadth and depth. Whereas in Chachma, the idea is an akudah. It's just a seminal idea, and it hasn't yet fully evolved into a conveyable concept. No one can convey the akudah of Chachma. You need to have the dimensions of Bina to make it plausible to be able to convey something. So when we talk about Gilui, Eira Seichel, where is the Gilui? The Gilui is in Bina. In Chachma it's still Behelim. So, what do we mean when we say Uvahatzirufi Eisius Am Matzrif Chachma? When it comes to the mode of articulating the idea that this originates in Chachma, not in Bina. So what's this all about? Before the bracket we had said it was a sort of a thing, it comes hand in hand together, but if we unpack it, it would seem that the concept is coming from Bina, and then the articulation of the concept is coming from Chachma. So what's going on here? Ha inyan. The idea is as follows. Even though the way in which you articulate an idea is going to be dependent on the very idea which you are articulating. Yes? Certain ideas will demand a certain mode of articulation, so other ideas will demand a different mode of articulation. So that would be the idea comes from Bina, and the articulation idea should therefore originate from Bina, based on that reasoning. Mikol Mokim, nevertheless, it's always possible to say the very same concept with different forms of articulation. How many times you see in Rishonim, they're ultimately, when you think it through, they're saying the same point. You'll find a Ritva, a Rashba, a Ramban, that they're gonna say the same point, but they use different Asias. So the Asias are flexible. They can the tzirufim, the way that you're going to articulate an idea is variable. Okumoi, like he gives an example, Tevas Adain Olam. You have the words Adain Olam, master of the world. What is the concept that is being expressed and being enclosed in these words? It's the idea of sovereignty and dominion. That Hashem is the master and controller over the whole world. This concept of divine sovereignty could have been expressed in different combinations of letters. and words. You could have said Kumoi, Melech ha'olam ha'kodem, like we do many times. You refer to the Eibishter. Say Hashem is Melech ha'olam, the King of the world. Seemingly, the words Adon Olam and Melech ha'olam are very comparable, if not identical, concepts, even though they're different Sirufi Osius. The Imkain, Mashnis Labish, Haseichel b'Sirufi Osius Elu. So in this context, in the context of the poem of Adon Olam, the fact that this concept of divine sovereignty is expressed and enclosed in these particular word letters, this particular combination of letters that spells out Adon Olam, you can't say it originates from the concept, because the concept could have been expressed in a different form. It's not dependent on the concept how you're going to express it, even though the concept itself has to be enclosed and exposed through these combinations of letters. You couldn't. I mean, there's a limit. You couldn't express Hashem's Adnus and Hashem's Malchus with a combination of letters that would refer to Hashem as I don't know, a footstool. That would not, or a chair. Maybe a chair you got thrown. That could work. A table. It wouldn't express it, right? So there's a limit. There's a context in how many and ways it can be expressed, but it's not exclusive to the words Adon Olam. So you can't say that the concept of Hashem's Adnus and Malchus and Memshala is the origin of the articulation Adon Olam, of putting the Aleph and the Dalet, the Vav, and the Nun, the end and Nun together, and the other letters. Ki'im min hakoyach hamatzarif comes from this quality the soul has of combining letters and producing words. And it's this koyach which the person has in their consciousness to produce letters, to produce words out of letters, and decide how this concept is going to be expressed. Sometimes it will say Adon Olam when it wants to say that, and sometimes it will say Melech ha'olam. This combining quality that person has is not from Bina, which is the origin of the articulate of the expressible concept, but rather from Chachma, which is ultimately the origin of the expressed concept too. So just like in Bina, when you produce the seichel, when the seichel comes in an elaborate form, and it has dimensions, and it has an identity. It's not just an akuda. It's just not just what we call the flash of lightning of Chachma, but it's the hisrachavus of Bina, the expansiveness and expressiveness of Bina. Where did that expressiveness and expansiveness of Bina come from? It also came from Chachma. So together with it, with the idea, comes also the method of articulation of that idea. They're both mushrash, they're both originating in Chachma. So in that sort of bracket, we've resolved the potential confusion about these two things. But we need to now get back to what we're actually talking about. And what word does he use to get back to what we're really talking about? The nimtza. So again, we've got this a way of drawing everything back to the central theme and point we want to talk about. The nimtza. The chol kabbalas hadibur hu min haseichel v'al yidei eisis hamachshava. The entire, here the emphasis here is on entire process, both the content and the mode of articulation of an idea is received in dibur from the seichel via the letters of speech. So we've constructed, this is the relationship of speech to its superior keiches. Speech itself is a tool, is a means for expressing the seichel. And because we want the seichel to be expressed, it has to be externalized. So we use something called dibur. Dibur itself is just a means to that end. That's what we're saying over here, or what we're suggesting. And what it seems to be the case, that not merely the content of what a person says, but also the mode in which the decision about which words to use and how to do it, is also a quality of the nefesh. It's a quality of the seichel. It's a quality of the midos. But it's not a quality of dibur. Dibur doesn't have any decision-making power about how to express these words, these ideas. It's all part of the package. When it gets an idea, it comes with the instructions of which words to put together. And what does dibur do? It speaks them. So it's entirely dependent on the consciousness. And if that's the case, if what we've said until now is entirely true, then seemingly it would stand to reason that it's not plausible to suggest that there would be any greater intensity of a concept or an idea in the articulation of speech than that idea had when it was just in the seichel or in the machshava. So the way the idea is contained within the nefesh, and then, as we said before, that is immediately and always expressed through machshava. Immediately, there you have the full richness of the idea, and for it to come down into dibur is a diminution of it. It's a reduction of it. And even if you wanted to go as far to say that you could fully articulate with all of the intensity of the idea the way it is in your machshava, that might be, that would be the biggest you could maybe try to suggest. But to say that there would be a tosefes oir seichel, that it would be enhanced, why should the seichel be enhanced in dibur? What is dibur? Dibur is nothing. Everything dibur has originated already in the seichel. So why would you even think that through articulating in speech you'd be able to somehow enhance and improve upon that idea? Because it's from the seichel where the entire content and method of expression originated from and taken from. So the dibur itself should seemingly have nothing more to add. As we know, what we're going to see, that dibur as a makabel, as a kois, is able to do magical things with ideas. That as soon as they come down into speech and articulate in speech, a transformation happens in the ability to understand ideas and concepts, and even to have experience certain feelings. And that, similar to what we said before, the power the Isha has to create another human being, similarly dibur has a power to create and stimulate novel and deeper ideas that are capable than if a person would be only thinking and never speaking and articulating.